on minimum wages as an instrument to reduce inequality in emerging markets. My name is Albert Park. I'm the director of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology Institute for Emerging Market Studies. Today we're going to address a topic which I think previously has mainly focused on how minimum wages have affected employment and inequality in developed countries. There's been much less work trying to compare the experiences of emerging markets. And so our goal today is to try to shed some new light on what is happening and try to think about how the role of minimum wages may be different in emerging market settings compared to developed country settings. And we're very fortunate to have four very distinguished panel members to talk with us. The first is Carl Lin, who is an assistant professor of economics at Beijing Normal University, coming to us from Taipei. He's been part of a large research project on minimum wages in China. The second person is Haroon Borat, who is the director of the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town and an expert on South Africa's labor market. And third, we have Umarani, who's a senior development economist at the International Labor Office Research Department. She's an expert on minimum wage issues in India and has been doing also some cross-country research on minimum wages. And finally, we have Jimena Del Carpio, who is a senior economist at the World Bank, currently working in the East Asia and Pacific Social Protection and Labor Unit, and has been working recently in particular on minimum wage issues in Southeast Asia. So without any, I should also mention that if you would like to send questions, you can do so through social media, in particular Facebook, and you can also follow us on Twitter throughout tonight's broadcast. Okay, let me start. I want to start by trying to get a better sense of what is driving the increased use of minimum wage regulations in emerging markets. So maybe I can start with you, Carl. Can you tell us why minimum wages are rising so quickly in China, where it seems to be faster than anywhere else? What is the motivation of the city government to be raising the minimum wages? You unmute.
Albert and everyone. The experience of minimum wage in China is pretty new. China started its minimum wage experience in 1994. So since then, after 10 years, in 2004, China has its revision of the minimum wage regulation in 2004. That legislation in 2004 specifies that at least the minimum wage should renew once every 2 years. So that's the main reason that in China, the minimum wage levels of frequency raised so high after 2004. So that's the first question, that why the minimum wage rising so quickly in China, because the 2004 regulation is specified that at least every 2 years, each government, provincial government, should renew the minimum wage standard once every 2 years. And the other question is about why the city government want to raise the minimum wage so high. It's very interesting question because the minimum wage regulation in China, there was no national minimum wage standard in China. So the provincial government, 31 provinces, has absolutely powerful and flexible power to set its minimum wage standard in each year. So that's why the city government, provincial government, they want to set its minimum standard each year quickly as possible, because the reason that this kind of reason that racing to the bottom or racing to the top, that once Beijing governments, for example, raise the minimum wage in 1 year, the neighborhood like Hebei province or Shandong province, they don't want to lose their face. So they want to raise the minimum wage compared to Beijing government or the other provinces. So they want to move according to the 2004 minimum wage standard. They want to move or raise the minimum wage standard higher than their neighborhood country. So that's the main reason, that it's all because the 2004 regulations.
Great, thanks. Uma, maybe you can jump in here. I know that minimum wages have also been rising faster than average wages in India. Can you talk a little bit about what is the process in India for determining minimum wages and why is it leading to these increases?
Thanks, Albert, for inviting me for this Google Hangout. Now, as you know, that minimum wages in India has been through the Minimum Wage Act 1948, and what it does is it sets the minimum wages for different schedules of employment who are largely within the unskilled labor force. So as a result, you have minimum wages that are being set up at the state level for certain occupations at the central level, and there are also certain sectoral and occupational level minimum wages that are being set up. Now, who sets the minimum wage in India is a very good question because, as per the Minimum Wage Act, we have two methods of doing it. One is that the appropriate government, whether it be the central or the state, can actually set it up through committees and subcommittees. And they basically try to advise the government through their inquiry mechanisms as to what the minimum wages should be. Now, these subcommittees and committees also have these advisory boards that coordinate the work of the committees, and they take into consideration the needs of the workers and also the economic conditions of the country before setting up the minimum wage. Now, even with regard to revisions, you have the similar advisory board actually coming in. Now, the second method that is used often is also that the government notifies through a very official gazette mechanism as to what the minimum wage for a particular occupation should be. So you have these variation as to how the minimum wage can be set. And further, you have in certain occupations there's a basic wage being set up, and in certain others you have the basic wage and the variable DNS allowance. To complicate a bit more the life, let me tell you that if you can take a case of a particular occupation like the brick kilns in east of India, say West Bengal, you find that the minimum wages are being set up through government notification and also through collective agreements. So it's a very complicated procedure as far as India is concerned with the minimum wage setting. Now, to answer your second question saying that minimum wages have been rising, that's true. Actually, average wages in India have been rising very fast. If you look for the period 2006 to 12, the nominal wages have actually gone up by 135%, and the nominal minimum wage has actually gone up only by about 74.2%. And if you try to take it in terms of real terms, then you find that actually the real minimum wage is only 2%. So all the increase that you see in minimum wage over the last 6 years or so is actually just the adjustment for inflation. And what's been a bit sad as far as the adjustment procedures is concerned is that it should be regularly adjusted periodically at least once in 2 years, and that is not what we have been seeing in India.
Okay, that's very interesting. So I think also, of course, in China, minimum wages have been rising very fast, which is one reason why the minimum wages have been rising as well. Haroon, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you think minimum wages are being set in South Africa and how that compares to what we're hearing from China and India.
Great, thanks Albert, and thanks for including me in this conversation. So in the South African context, I think it's important to put it into context that minimum wage legislation exists, if you like, within a broader framework of collective bargaining between representative trade unions and employer associations. So it's sort of a dual system of wage formation. In the case of minimum wages, they are set at a sectoral level. So, Carl speaking of minimum wages set at the city level, at a provincial level. In the South African context, the if you like, the marker for setting is sector-based, and the way in which it works is that the Minister of Labour is asked by vulnerable workers, by trade unions, by NGOs, to investigate a particular sector where vulnerable workers may be present, and in that instance, the minister would then, following a period of research and investigation, may promulgate a minimum wage. So within that context, we presently have 11 sectoral minimum wages within which they are set either by area, occupation, in some cases even firm size. So what that means is that, to talk to your initial point, we in the developing country context, you do see a variety of legislative provisions, and in South Africa, you see it, minimum wages set at a sectoral level, totaling in our context over 167 different individual wage levels.
Great, thanks a lot. So Jimena, finally, let's turn to Southeast Asia. I know that there are many also, just like in India and South Africa, there seem to be many different minimum wages. What do you see as the advantages and disadvantages of this type of diversity in the minimum wages?
Yes, thank you, Albert, for inviting me to the conversation, and thanks for the question. Indeed, I'm going to follow up on Haroon's points by saying that first, yes, there are countries. I mean, the diversity with Southeast Asia is quite wide. You have countries that have national minimum wages, and then you have countries that have even sectoral minimum wages in many sectors, and with many exemptions. Now, in a country like Cambodia, you have a single sector minimum wage that is bound by the regulation, and then you have, of course, other countries where all sectors are bound by the regulation. Now, the advantages that we see, of course, is that you can tailor the level of the minimum wage and even the implementation to the sector specific or even the geographic region that is done by a particular level, which makes it very appealing because it sets a level that's very appropriate for that set of people at that point in time. Now, there are a lot of disadvantages, especially in developing countries where data are really scarce, especially in lower income countries in the Southeast Asian region. And then there's a limited capacity to really both determine the appropriate level, what is the appropriate level for that region, that sector, and also to determine a level when collective bargaining is involved, when you have different types of capacities in collective bargaining in the subnational levels, or even some sectors that have no collective bargaining present at all. And so there you start embarking into potential distortions to the labor market more than actually helping sectors or regions. And one example that one could give is if you have a really high level in one region and then a much lower level in another region, then you have workers going into that region. One would say that's great, but then you have, and even for sectors that is great, but then you may starve some sectors of workers, and then you have what was mentioned by Carl earlier, that you have some regions trying to compete upwards and perhaps even exceeding its own appropriate level. The same for sectors. So again, the complexity of implementation of multiple, where there's difficulty accessing proper data and making the determination that's appropriate makes it challenging.
Right. So it seems like this seems to be one difference with developed countries, where in most cases in developed countries there may be state-specific or region-specific wages, but not all of this diversity across occupations or sectors, located in the same place. And this seems like it could raise lots of distortion. Obviously, this seems to have to be related back to the whole political process and how, we seem to be seeing a real diversity in how these wages are being determined. So let me turn to another kind of the second topic I want to get to, which is another aspect in which many people have kind of commented that things are different in emerging markets than in developed countries, and that is this issue of compliance. So I think we take for granted that if in a developed country, if a minimum wage regulation is passed, that it will be enforced and everyone will follow the law. But in developing countries, when we have lots of informality and maybe more limits on state capacity, the compliance issues may be quite different, and we have to think about that in terms of what the impacts of the minimum wage regulations are going to be. So Uma, maybe I can turn to you. I know you've been studying how compliance with minimum wage laws differs across different countries. Can you say a little bit about what you're finding in that research?
Yeah, sure. Actually, it was also quite interesting to do this research to find out whether the results are very similar to what one observes within the developed country context. And you find that the story is somewhat quite different because actually, as far as the compliance question is concerned, which has become one of the big issues as far as minimum wages is concerned, there could be a number of factors that actually can influence it, but here I try to bring out some 4 factors which could be responsible as to why you do not have so-called perfect compliance. The first one is actually related to what is the coverage of minimum wage. Does it cover all the workers or does it only cover part of the workers? If it only covers part of the workers, then it is actually becoming very difficult to administer it, and that leads to further confusion as to who gets minimum wages and who should not. And this is particularly a problem, at least in the group of developing countries that we have been studying. We see, especially for India and South Africa, where there's much more partial coverage of minimum wages. Now, the second issue that comes up is with regard to the kind of system of minimum wages do you have. I think we've talked a bit about it in the first round. And here, what I'm trying to lead you to is this the level of complexity of the system. Like, you have a country like Brazil, which has a simple national minimum wage system. Now, when you have a simple national minimum wage system, it's very easy to enforce, it's very easy to administer, compared to other systems which are very complex. Like in India, you have minimum wages being set up for about 1,679 categories, or you have South Africa, which is spread across, looks like 11 sectoral determinations, but it is across firms and certain other occupations, which makes it much more complex. Now, in such systems, to administer minimum wages is quite difficult. And then you have certain hybrid systems where there have been some attempts to solve a bit the problem, where you have a binding national floor, minimum wage floor, and then you have occupational based minimum wages. So actually the complexity of the system also plays a very important role. The third is the level at which the minimum wage is set. If the level is set too low, everybody complies. There's absolutely no problem. You get fantastic numbers with regard to compliance. And we have seen that in some of the Asian countries and also some of the Latin American countries. But if the minimum wage is set too high, then we find that the non-compliance is very low. So, it becomes very important to see at what level the minimum wage is set. And this needs to take into consideration both the basic needs concept as well as the economic situation. The last factor which is very important is the kind or the nature of compliance mechanism that you have put in place. Now, we do know that labor inspections is one of the systems that has been working throughout the world, but a labor inspection alone cannot do cannot solve all the problems. I think we have seen that in Brazil, unions have been negotiating and unions have been quite involved, or in India we found that civil society is quite involved in it, and that could play a very effective role in ensuring that there is more compliance. Or you could have a kind of a system that we have seen in Costa Rica recently, where there's been much more about information and awareness campaigns, where you have the minimum wage campaigns which have helped them to improve compliance. So I think these are the factors that could actually play a very important role as far as complying with minimum wages is concerned.
Uma, let me follow up with you. We had a question from social media asking about how do you enforce minimum wages in the unorganized sector, or more broadly, the informal sector. India has, 90% plus of the labor force is in the informal sector. How can you even think about enforcing minimum wage regulations in that context?
I think this is a very good question. I think before I get down to answering the question, I would like to also make just one more statement saying that there's a general notion that, minimum wages is largely for the formal sector workers, but actually whether you see the minimum wage for unskilled workers or in India or for low-paid workers in South Africa, and also where you have full coverage as in Brazil and many of the other countries, you find that actually everybody is covered. Informal sector workers are covered in a sense. It's not excluding the informal sector workers, and I think that's very important for us to remember. Now in India, we find that as far as 2009-10 is concerned, about 73% of the wage workers in the informal sector have been covered. What was very important to note is that in 2004-05, there was a Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act that was introduced. And this act actually, which was introduced, laid down two basic principles. That is that wages have to be paid at minimum wages, and that there would be equal remuneration for both males and females. And the other issue was that there would be right to information and social audits, where the civil society actually played a very important role. Now, as a result of all this, actually what we have seen is that compliance has actually increased in India from 32% in 2004-05 to 61% in 2009-10. So if you have the right mechanisms in place, you can ensure effective implementation of minimum wages.
They're subject to the minimum wage regulations. So it doesn't mean if you're in the informal sector that that enforcement is impossible. So I think that's a good point. Haroon, let me bring it back to you to tell us a little bit about South Africa, the compliance situation there. And I know you've also been doing some work about thinking of how to measure compliance more systematically. Maybe you can say a few words about that as well.
Sure, thanks, Albert. So in the South African context, about 45% on average of all these sectoral determinations I spoke about earlier, 45% of all minimum wage workers actually earn below the minimum. So you've got a fair degree of non-compliance. Just by way of comparison, for Chile, the figure is about 18%. And certainly for some of the numbers for developing countries, they would vary between anywhere between sort of 15 to 70% below the minimum wage. If I could just sort of dip into a little bit of what Uma's reflected on in terms of determinants of compliance before talking about our measure of compliance. For me, there's sort of 4 or 5 key factors which do impact on compliance with the minimum wage in a developing country setting, at least from some of the work we've done. The one is around firm characteristics. We tend to find that larger firms relative to smaller firms, even when controlling for formality, are more likely to comply. Obviously, formal sector firms, given the context of a minimum wage, would be more likely to comply. There are a whole bunch of spatial characteristics, so firms that are further away from urban centers or centers of employment are more likely to comply. A third key factor is the nature of the inspectorate. So if a state or a central government or a provincial authority invests in resources in an inspectorate, they are more likely, you're more likely to see compliance with the law. This enforcement can come in the form of financial resources, so more inspectors, more foot soldiers, so to speak. It can also come in the form of strong public campaigns and so on, which is quite common in a developing country context. We've seen some work around Costa Rica from Tim Gindling and so on around, if you like, compliance coming through marketing campaigns, as it were. The fourth key factor, Albert, is local labor market conditions. So you may find in high unemployment areas, workers would have less bargaining power, and therefore employers are more likely to violate the law, and the unemployed more likely to accept lower minimum wages below the minimum wage. The final one is what Uma referred to as the KITES index, which is depending on where the minimum wage is set relative to the mean or the median, depending on how you measure it, you're likely to see differential outcomes in terms of compliance. So then just very quickly on our measure, we're quite careful to think about, it's a measure developed in conjunction with Ravi Kanbur around not just the incidence or the proportion of workers below the minimum wage, but to look at the distance below the minimum wage. So it's a measure of relative violation, which turns on the Foster-Greer-Thorbecke measure of poverty, but essentially tries to understand not just the 45% or the 18% proportion below the minimum wage, but to get a sense of how far below the minimum wage workers are. And in that sense, you get a more nuanced assessment of the depth of violation or the depth of non-compliance with the minimum wage.
Thanks. Jimena, in Southeast Asia, and by the way, I should correct my introduction. Jimena is now working in Europe and Central Asia, I guess, for the bank. In Southeast Asia, where you've done work, as I think as similar to what Uma was saying, I think a lot of people are not necessarily covered in some countries by the minimum wage regulations. So I'm curious how you think that this uneven coverage affects the minimum wage impacts in those countries, or if you have any other thoughts about this compliance issue.
Yes, indeed. In Southeast Asia, I mean, again, we're talking about a lot of countries, so there's a variety of compliance with the minimum wage law. Now, the breadth is such that you have many countries where wage employment, there's a lot of informality in wage employment, small businesses that actually are not even registered. So you have workers that are there, and a lot of them, some countries, 99% of businesses are small, medium enterprises, so you have quite a chunk of workers that are there. Now, you also have large segments that are in agriculture still, and many that are self-employed. Many taxi drivers, take the case of Thailand, where they actually, some register, some don't. And of course, self-employment, how do you enforce a minimum wage on a self-employed? And this is a question that one needs to ask. Of course, a person would want to earn as much as they possibly can. Now, there are cases where the rise of the minimum wage is so drastic that indeed it segments the market. You see this duality actually widen. You see that it's more difficult to enter formality for some workers that are so far below the level of productivity that the minimum wage would require for them to be paid. And so in that case, really you see an exacerbation of this dual labor market. Now, you can also see the opposite effect, where you do see that the minimum wage serves as an information tool, sort of what we call in the literature a lighthouse effect. It has an effect on the informal sector indirectly, in the sense that workers in the informal sector that are at that margin, they know what the formal sector is paying, and so they can bargain up. It doesn't mean that they will bargain up as far high as the minimum wage, but at least when the minimum wage rises, they have some information that allows them to bargain an increase in the wage they earn closer to what that increase has been. Again, you do see both effects, and overall, in some countries, you do see on average a positive effect of a minimum wage increase when it's moderate, and not so much when it's more drastic. So again, ex ante, it's very difficult to know what the effect will be on the informal sector unless you know how far the informal wages are from where the minimum wage is, and then how much of a pool of available workers is in that part of the wage distribution. So really, it's country by country that one would have to answer this question.
Okay, I think you raised a number of very interesting points there. I mean, one is this idea that if you have difference in compliance across sectors, that a high wage in one sector could actually drive people into a more informal or less compliant sector, and so that makes I think we're starting to understand the situation much more complicated actually in many emerging market contexts. And the other, I think, really interesting thing that you raised is that the effects of minimum wage regulations are not just on people earning very low wages, but can have creeping effects of people at higher parts of the wage distribution, because it kind of sets an anchoring point for negotiations or other factors that are determining the wage level. So I think that's also an important point, which I know that's an issue that people are talking about here in Hong Kong as well in discussion of the minimum wage issues.
Right,
okay,
Albert, can I? Oh, sorry,
yeah.
can I add something to that point? Indeed, I think the last point you raised is quite important, which I didn't mention explicitly, which is that when we do have an increase in the minimum wage, the wage distribution changes not only for the minimum wage and below, as I mentioned, the lighthouse effect, but also up to the top. And so in some cases, you see that the minimum wage in companies that are very thin on the management layer, you see that a lot of the employees will actually see a rise. So the costs on the employer side are quite large, and that's something that's important to measure when we look at the impact of minimum wage. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I think the conversation is moving kind of toward a discussion of the main kind of focus of the Hangout tonight, which is, or today in the East Coast, tonight here in Hong Kong, and that is, can minimum wage actually influence inequality outcomes? And I want to bring it back to Carl. I haven't forgotten about you, Carl. Can you say something about what you're finding, both on the compliance side, if you have anything to say about compliance, but especially in what you think is happening in terms of the effect of these rising minimum wages in China on employment, wages, and inequality?
So, all right, the compliance rate in China is pretty high compared to other developing countries. According to our survey or our calculation, the compliance rate in China is over 92% compared to other developing countries. So 92% of the workers, they're earning over the minimum wage is pretty high. So the other question is about what are those effects of minimum wage on employment, on wages, and inequality. Actually, there's very limited studies or research about these questions of minimum wage in China. Luckily, I'm involved in the major research project in China. So according to our study, I should say that in the beginning, let us say that the minimum wage experience in China is pretty new. China started its minimum wage regulation in 1994, but not until 2004. China promulgated the minimum wage regulation of 2004 that the magnitude and frequency of minimum wage changes have been very substantial, both over time and across different provinces or jurisdictions. What I mean is that in January 2004, China issued a new minimum wage regulation, which is called the Minimum Regulation 2004. That regulation 2004 requires local government should renew the minimum wage standard at least once every 2 years. So that increased the frequency a lot. The second point in the law says that it should extend the coverage to employees in self-employed businesses and to those non-full-time workers, especially those migrants in China. And third one, the 2004 regulation quintuple, which is 5 times more the penalties of violations or non-compliances. So these points, which is written into the law of 2004, really raised the compliance or enforcement of the minimum wage regulation in China. So that regulation was put into effect in March 1st of 2004 and leads to frequent and substantial increase in minimum wage in the following years. According to that, so that 2004 is a very good natural experiment for economists like us. So our research about how minimum wage affect the first one, wages and employment, and also inequality in China. According to our research, the first one, can the increase of minimum wage can help increase the wages in China? The answer is yes. According to our research, with the increase of minimum wage after 2004 can really help to increase the wages for young adults, those people ages between 16 to 29 years old, or those people who are at risk, which means their wages are between the old and the new minimum wages, or the women or the less skilled worker. Their wages can be raised by the new minimum wage standards. And the second one, can the minimum wage the increase of minimum wage can reduce the employment in China? And the answer is yes. So that's why it's a really complicated situation in China that the raise of minimum wage since 2004 can help to increase the wages of people in China, the workers in China. On the other hand, it can hurt employment in China as well, especially for those workers who are between the older or the newer minimum wage standard, or the women or less skilled worker, and also for those young adults. They are hurt by the minimum wage increases. So it's complicated. It's a trade-off for the Chinese government. When you increase the minimum wage standard, it can help to increase the wages for Chinese workers. On the other hand, it can create disemployment, which is important for the worker, especially for the young adult. women, and also less skilled workers. And the last question, can the minimum wage help to reduce, or for other situation, can the minimum wage increase can help to reduce inequality in China? That's a really good question, because according to our studies that in mainland China, it's very interesting that in mainland China, the situation is really interesting compared to the United States and Mexico. Let me put it this way. In the United States and Mexico, they both exhibit declining minimum wage in the past 30 years. And they have rising inequality and also declining minimum wage in the past 30 years. On the other hand, in China experienced increasing minimum wage and also rising inequality in the past 10 years. So it's kind of comparison between China, United States, and Mexico. For the study in US and Mexico, for those, they have declining minimum wage and rising inequality. Those studies show that declining minimum wage account for a substantial part of the growth in inequality in United States and Mexico over the past 30 years. And the conclusion for the US and Mexico, they say that had not been minimum wage decreases, inequality in US and Mexico would have been lower. On the other hand, in China, we find that our research found that minimum wage increase helps reduce the income gap, especially in the lower tail of the income distribution for those, for example, the median worker and the 10th percentile at the bottom end. And our conclusion shows that had not been minimum wage increases in China, income inequality in urban China would have been higher, which means that our conclusion shows that minimum wage regulation increase in China really plays important and central role in China, not only for developed countries, but also for developing countries like China. So that's how we show that minimum wage effect on wages, employment, and also equality. In sum, we show that minimum wage does have positive effect, statistical significance for wages, but it might have disemployment effect for the workers. And finally, we show that minimum wage increase can really help to reduce inequality for the bottom end of income distribution and try inequality, rate inequality. Yes.
All right. Thanks, Carl. So let me try to bring it to our other panelists, this issue about impacts. Uma, can you speak to this issue about the impact of minimum wages in reducing inequality in India or other countries?
Yeah, I think I'll try to keep myself just to India and then try talking about it. Actually, what we have seen is that minimum wages have had quite a huge impact on inequality in India. If we try to compare the period over just the past decade, 2004 to 5 to 2009-10, we find at the bottom end of the distribution, actually inequality has reduced by about 13 percentage points. That's a huge increase. We had actually done earlier a very interesting simulation exercise for just the period 2005, and the average wages were really low. And we assumed that if everybody were to get a minimum wage, what would happen? And we tried separating it for casual and for salaried workers. And we found for the casual workers, inequality reduces by about 18 percentage points, and for the salaried workers, it reduces by about 6 percentage points. So you see very clearly that minimum wage, which is largely set for low-skilled, low-paid workers, can have huge impacts on inequality. Now, the issue is, under what conditions does these minimum wage work? Does it work only in certain conditions or not? It's a larger question that we need to address. And here 3 things come to my mind quickly. One is in a sort which has been raised by Carl Lin, in a sense, is that the adjustments. If the adjustments are not periodically done, and if the minimum wage is just left at the level it is, then it becomes a very meaningless instrument or a tool for redistribution. And that we have very clearly seen in the case of the US and Mexico, as he mentions. The second issue is, I get back to what I had said earlier, is the level at which you set the minimum wage. If again the minimum wage is set too low, then it again is meaningless. It does not really help workers down at the bottom end of the distribution to improve their earnings and go out. And that we've been seeing quite a bit in Vietnam, Mexico, and many other countries where minimum wages have been quite low. The third issue is with regard to the coverage. If actually not all workers are covered and only some of the workers are covered, then actually the partial coverage erodes completely the potential that minimum wage could have to redistribute the resources in favor of low-paid workers. So actually all these factors are very important while looking at this whole issue of impact of minimum wages on inequality.
Great, thank you. There's this interesting connection between the compliance issue, I think, and the impacts on.
Very much. Very much.
And but I'm curious. There seems to be great optimism so far in this potential role for minimum wage to affect inequality. In developed countries, I think there's some skepticism that even when you can impact the wages of some of the low-skilled workers, in terms of the overall income distribution, do these workers really live in poor households? In terms of their actual poverty levels, are we really targeting very, very well through this? I think it's a much more disputed kind of idea. Let me bring in Jimena. What is your view about the role of the minimum wage in affecting inequality, based on the places that you've looked at this?
Yes, indeed. We've looked at the literature very, very in depth, specifically for Southeast Asia, but all over the world. And we find that really the effect on poverty and inequality is quite mixed all around the world. And in fact, it's difficult to know ex ante for developing countries what will happen. As I mentioned earlier, the fact that you have such high levels of informality and non-compliance and people that are well below the productivity level that a minimum wage would merit. And so you have workers, the vast majority of workers that are poor, say in the agricultural sector or even in self-employment, and they're less skilled and are employed in the informal sectors for a reason. And really, some of them are even in social assistance, unemployed, and so on. And so it's very difficult to know what the effect on the poor and on inequality would be. And as a matter of fact, one would say that it's important to remember what the minimum wage policy as a tool was put in place to do. And it really was not meant to address poverty issues, though it could indirectly, and in many cases it does affect it positively, but it can also affect it negatively. So in some senses, it's like giving the wrong medicine for an illness, that there's a better medicine for it. And an example that I always remind people is that it's really meant, the minimum wage is really meant to make corrections to the functioning of the labor market, which keep wages low for other reasons. And there are many other tools that help on the redistribution and on alleviation. And one example would be targeted social protection tools like cash transfers, conditional cash transfers. That's the case of Brazil, where you've seen that actually it has had a positive effect. And this is the conditional cash transfers in having an effect on the poverty, on the poor, and on redistribution. And also there are income tax credit examples that are used in the US to target the low wage workers. So really just thinking what the minimum wage is meant to do, and is it really the best tool to address poverty. And I think countries doesn't merit that, doesn't say that it is the best tool for both redistribution or poverty alleviation. So perhaps a complementary set of tools for those people that would not be affected by the minimum wage would be necessary to think of, again, comprehensively improving their skills so that they can merit the minimum wage eventually, and meanwhile they are on a training program with vouchers and social assistance, targeted social assistance. So really not using the minimum wage, not overloading the minimum wage to fix all ills in society is important to keep in mind.
Right. So I think, again, several, I think, useful points. One is that, whatever we think the effect of the minimum wage policies are on inequality, we have to balance that against the other policy options that we can use in terms of the cost effectiveness, the etc. And so that's important. And also, we should think of the minimum wage kind of working in complement potentially with other policies to achieve multiple types of policy objectives. rather than just thinking of the minimum wage in isolation. Haroon, let me give you a chance to take a crack at this question as well about impacts of minimum wages on employment wages and/or inequality, especially inequality.
Sure, thanks, Albert. I think in the South African context, what well, let me step back a bit. Let me talk to I think generically how one can think about minimum wage impacts on inequality. If you find, doing your, doing the econometrics carefully, if you find that minimum wages do increase average wages, so even for those workers below the minimum wage, you can do that. And if you find wages have increased, then conditional on no employment effects or disemployment effects, then you will see wage compression within the existing workforce that are treated or affected by the minimum wage. The problem, though, is, and that's why the outcomes are unclear, is when you do see unemployment effects. So if you do see unemployment effects, what you've generated in a distributional sense is a whole bunch of zero earners, right? So what you've done is created a pool of unemployed, and if you assume that they were part of the affected workforce from the minimum wage, the impact on inequality may be either neutral or you may see an increase in inequality. The other thing ties in with Jimena's point about overall inequality in a society. So minimum wages may be one tool, but you may find that overall inequality, of course, is affected by a whole range of other factors. So if I could use just two examples, both from Brazil, to display the point. Work by Lemos indicates that there was wage compression in the Brazilian labor market for existing minimum wage workers. So for workers who were targeted, there was wage compression. However, recent work done by Chico Ferreira and others looking at overall inequality in Brazil over a similar period, doing decompositions and so on, find that the minimum wage actually contributed to an increase in overall inequality. And so, and I think that's the difficulty analytically with this type of work, is that you may get wage compression, but if there are disemployment effects, then the outcome on inequality is unclear. And then furthermore, the overall sort of societal inequality levels may be influenced by much more than the minimum wage.
So I want to kind of finish up our conversation by thinking about what we've learned in terms of policy advice for leaders in emerging markets who are trying to sort through all of this complexity about the role of minimum wage regulations. Jimena, let me bring it back to you. You seem a little bit skeptical about kind of the reliability of using a minimum wage policy to attack inequality issues. If minimum wages aren't doing a good job for dealing with inequality, is there any real reason to have minimum wages? If we just kind of accept that we can't change the world and minimum wages are here to stay for good or for bad, is there advice that we can give to help policymakers make the minimum wage more effective in realizing the goals that they're setting?
Yes, thanks for that question. I think that's it's a fair question given some of the comments I've made. And we find that in countries where the minimum wage really reflects a real wage floor, in other words, the right data are used and the right context is put in place in the decision-making process of the level to arrive at an appropriate level given the economy and all the other conditions, then you find that really minimum wages can protect workers with low bargaining power from exploitation, from all those issues that were in place to begin with that prompted the introduction of the minimum wage. For example, when employers have a lot of power and they hold wages down artificially, then this is where the minimum wage really has a clear role to play. Now, in cases where informality or the shifts between formal and informal sector are not large, you see that minimum wages can increase household income, but again, that depends a lot on compliance and on the level of productivity of workers. So as long as the level of productivity of worker keeps rising, as we see in many developing countries that are making great investments on skills of the workforce, and we are in an era where data are increasing and are getting better, and this is an investment worth making. making, having a more appropriate level, then indeed the minimum wage has a very positive potential role to play for as an information mechanism. Hopefully, as you see in many developed countries, many workers are well above the minimum wage. The minimum wage is just a floor, and then many of them have skill levels that are very much above what the minimum wage level would be. So that's what you strive for. But again, setting the floor or setting a level that is appropriate is really, really quite important if we want the tool to really work and have the effect, the positive effects that it can have, and that we've seen it have in many countries.
So it seems like you're saying that if we set the wage, optimally in some sense, it can be effective. But then we kind of get back to our earlier discussion about how the ways in which these minimum wages are set seem to be kind of infused with politics and interest groups. And so, how confident in different settings can we be that the wages are being set, in a way that's in some sense optimal in terms of the desired outcomes as opposed to being subject to politics.
Yes, Albert, can I add, sorry, I'm sorry, I'm going to jump back in, but in terms of, as I mentioned, we are in an era of plentiful or increasing quality of data and techniques to really have more objective measures or objective tools to help us make that decision of the level. Now, of course, that does not substitute the bargaining or the collective bargaining negotiation between the different stakeholders. So complementing that negotiation with objective tools that bring into the conversation data and context really make it closer to, makes us more powerful and get us closer to an optimal level. Yes, so it's not impossible.
So that's a good point too, that maybe the World Bank and other experts can kind of provide a useful toolkit for policymakers to think about the right way to set minimum wages based on international experiences about the impacts. Carl, let me ask you, do you have any advice for Chinese policymakers? I think other than the potential disemployment effects, you seem to be saying that the minimum wages are being implemented and having positive outcomes. Is there any deficiencies or advice that you would give? Unmute.
Yeah, Albert. That's good questions. I was consulted by the Chinese government, the Ministry of Labor, like 2 times before, attending the conferences and workshop and also internal meetings. And like I said, in year 2004, was the revision of the 1994 legislations. So after 10 years, about 2014 or 2015, next year, the government, they are thinking to revise the 2004 legislation again. And because, like I said in the beginning, the compliance in China is pretty good, like over 92, 93%. Enforcement is also pretty well. And also, the coverage is also great. It covers all workers, including migrants in China. So according to my opinion, the only thing I would suggest is they should try to make the process of determining the minimum wage legislation or setting in a more scientific way. Because the setting or determination in China, in each province, they have 3 parties, from the government and from the labor union and from the enterprises. And the process of determining the minimum wage in each province, just like bargaining, is bargaining. Whether you have more bargaining power, either from the labor union, from the government, or from the business, then you can have higher minimum wage standard in each province. There's not a good scientific way, like formula, like in France or in UK. They have the more scientific way to set their minimum wage standard. So in the future, I would suggest that the Chinese government maybe can set a formula according to the CPI or GDP per capita or whatever in the future, in a more scientific way to set their minimum wage standard according to objective economic conditions. That's right.
Great, thanks. And Haroon, any thoughts on policy implications or messages?
I think for policymakers, I mean, at least for us stepping back, the minimum wage is not going anywhere. So I think in the toolkit for policymakers and arguably even politicians, the minimum wage is a ostensibly a useful populist tool to rally support, but also is often viewed as an instrument for supporting workers, reducing inequality and poverty, and so on. I think the evidence indicates that in most cases the political economy of minimum wage setting is what inevitably decides on the level that one arrives at. So the suggestion I would have to policymakers is utilize researchers, utilize background research, the new data that Hemant is talking about globally that is available to inform the minimum wage setting process. I mean, in the South African context, we're moving potentially from a sectoral minimum wage laws to a national minimum wage. So that's currently on the agenda. So I think the notion that policymakers do engage with the research community, do engage with the data and the results that are out there is really, really important. The evidence ultimately does suggest that one of the key variables is the level at which you set the minimum wage. I think if that is secured at a level which balances, if you like, welfare gains as against the job losses, then you've got a useful instrument as part of one's armory in terms of, if you like, growth and employment generation.
Thanks, Haroon. And finally, let me bring it to Uma to kind of wrap up and let you offer your thoughts on policy implications. And we have a question from Facebook as well. Someone asked, you had said that compliance in India had reached 61%. That hardly seems very effective if there's 39% lack of compliance. So any thoughts on that as well, Uma?
Thanks, Albert, for the last policy question. Actually, I want to bring in one of the points that was raised in the last section on the whole issue of inequality and poverty, like, the whole relevance of minimum wages as a tool for tackling inequality and poverty. And here I'd like to say, that whatever said and done, minimum wage is a redistributive tool, and let's not forget that. I think we need to work with other institutions, and we need to coordinate and link it well even with the collective bargaining institution as far as setting the minimum wage is concerned. But that does not do away with the thing saying, is minimum wage relevant or not relevant? I think every country is trying to tackle with it. We need to improve a number of mechanisms, but I think bottom line is there are a huge number of low-paid workers that exist who do not get the basic minimum to take care of their family needs, and I think we need to address this issue. Linking it with skills and all of that is a very good option. I think we could think about the issue is how do you deal with it. And that brings me to the point saying, the thing saying that, are the minimum wage workers really living in poverty households or not? Now, if you take the case of India, we have some evidence which shows that in the last decade, about 30% of the salaried workers and 40% of the casual workers actually belong to poor families, and they're all below minimum wage earners. And we find that about 50% of the minimum wage earners are also in poor households. So you can see very clearly that there are impacts as far as lifting all these families out of poverty is concerned. So, the issue is that of effectiveness. Now, it also connects to the question that you have been, that's been asked in the Facebook saying, 61% is it effective? Not at all. It's far below it. But actually, if you look at just 5 years ago in 2004-05, where we had about 32% compliance, this is quite an achievement to 61%. And I think to a very large extent, one has to give it to the NREGA Act, which was put into force. And also the average wages have been rising, which also made it easier to get the minimum wages. Now, as far as the policy is concerned, I think there are 2 points that I would like to raise as far as the Indian government is concerned. I think we have a very complex system of setting up the minimum wages. The complexity is needed, but I think there is also a need to have some sort of not a national minimum wage floor, which is not binding, but at least a state level minimum wage floor, which is quite binding. Every state has a state level minimum wage, and that should be extended to all workers. And that would, in some sense, take care of both your cost of living and also the regional variations that exist. The second thing that we need to explore a bit more, which is a bit of a black box, is how is the fixing of the minimum wage happening? Because there seems to be very complicated processes there. And I think if the government could do something on both these ends, that would be something useful both for researchers, for implementers, and for the ones who are going to receive the minimum wages. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're at our time, so I want to thank all of our speakers who participated in today's discussion. I think we're seeing a very rich set of complicated questions, and I think we can all see the value in the comparison of the experiences of different developing countries and emerging markets, and what they're finding in their experience with minimum wages. And so I think it lays out a really important and valuable kind of research agenda and policy discussion agenda going forward for emerging markets. So thank you very much, and good night, good afternoon, wherever you may be.